Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Hollis Woodard.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction, and to all of the Distinctive Voices crew for having me here tonight. So as Jennifer said, I do a lot of different things with bees. I want to just show one slide of some of my research crew out in Alaska last summer in a beautiful place. I know, I was jealous. I didn't get to go on this trip. So we do a lot of work with bumblebees. We work with them in the lab. We work on wild bumblebees in Alaska. I wanted to just kind of mention this work, but I'm mostly going to be talking about bee biology in general tonight, and then I'm going to talk about some of my work in bee conservation specifically. But I do have a research lab at UC Riverside and wanted to mention that to you. So I'm going to start with some basic facts about bees. You may already know many of these things. Like I always tell my students when I teach, maybe you already know all this stuff and it's a refresher for you, but never hurts to hear some things again. And then I'm giving you a little warning. I am gonna give some bad news about bees. So unfortunately, many bee species are facing extinction, and it's important to kind of say that and be real about where we are with our bee population. So I'm gonna, in the middle of the talk, give a little bit of bad news, but then I'm gonna close with some reasons for optimism and hope, because there are definitely a lot of exciting things happening right now in bee conservation, hence the title of my talk. So, some fun bee facts to begin with. You may or may not know this one, but there are more than 20,000 bee species worldwide. And in fact, this is a major underestimate because there are many species that have not been described yet. So there are a ton of different bees. And if you look at where these bees are distributed, here I'm showing you just the Americas, and this is a heat map of species diversity. So basically, the darker color means more species. And a couple patterns might pop out to you. One is that arid areas, so more desert areas, tend to have more bee biodiversity. And if you look at where we are in a hot spot in the western US, where there are just a ton of different bee species. I'm going to put some numbers on that in a future slide. So this gives you a sense of how bee diversity is distributed across the Americas. Here I'm showing you, now I'm zooming in a little bit more into most of North America. And let me break this figure down for you a little bit because there are a few different things going on. So the kind of different sections of the figure that are colored different colors all the way from black on one end to yellow on the other side. These are different World Wildlife Fund ecoregions. So this is just a way of splitting up geography by different ecosystems, essentially. And the areas here, again, that are darker colored have more bee species. So this is showing you kind of that same pattern, that in the western US, we have a ton of bee biodiversity. There's a second thing going on in this figure. This is the second little graph, or scale down at the bottom. This scales from green to red. This is essentially showing you how much have we collected, how much data do we have for different areas. So one thing to point out is you can see that there's been quite a lot of collecting in that part of the West where there are a lot of species, but there are also a lot of gaps. So there are probably many, many undescribed species in the western US because we simply haven't collected data there. So lots more exciting discoveries are going to be coming out about the bees that we have here, even in the US. Here's another way of showing you how diversity of bees is distributed here across the US. And this is kind of a fun study. So this is work done by a friend of mine, Olivia Messenger-Carroll and colleagues. She worked at Grand Staircase Escalante. That's the little blip right here in Utah, and she described 660 bee species in that one tiny little area. And contrast that with the number of bee species in the entire eastern US, which is about 750 species. So this is again kind of showing you that we have a ton of bee diversity out west. And again, I'll just make the point that we have a lot still to be described. This figure, I'm going to give you kind of the simple version of this, but this is a great study if you're interested in learning more. I've included the reference below. This study was looking at how much data do we have for bees across the US. And you can essentially think of it as areas where you have kind of darker blue and larger circles. We've collected more data. So there are pockets of the US, like especially in the Northeast, and some parts of California too, and in the West, where we've collected quite a few bee specimens and we've kind of described what's there. But there are a ton of gaps all through the US. So again, kind of underscoring the point that we have a lot of bees here and we probably have a lot more than we even know about, which is exciting. So a little bit about bee biology and how bees live. So most bees have associations with flowering plants where they collect pollen and nectar for food. They feed on a little bit on the pollen, mostly on the nectar, these adult bees, but they're also collecting these floral resources and bringing them back to their nest and providing them to their offspring. So most bees have this kind of standard relationship with flowering plants, although some bees have a really close association with one or just a few plant species, and other bees go to lots of different flowering plants. But I want to tell you that when you have 20,000 plus species, you're bound to have a little bit of diversity in diet as well. And there's some really interesting other bees that consume other things. So this is a stingless bee in the genus Trigona. And this is a bee, they're commonly called vulture bees, and they feed on meat. So they will go visit rotting carcasses. They live in the tropics, and they'll collect some of that meat and they'll bring it back to their nest. So they're bees that kind of go against the grain when it comes to the standard relationships with flowering plants, although these bees do visit flowering plants as well. You also have some bees, including some species here in the desert areas that collect oils. So some flowering plants produce oils that the bees collect, and these bees will bring the oils back to the nest, and their larvae, their young, will feed on the oil for food. So they live on basically a high-fat diet. So you get bees in terms of nesting that nest in little snail shells. Most bees nest in the ground, or they'll nest in little twigs, but then you have a few bee lineages that kind of do their own thing, like this cute little osmia that nests and is co-evolved to nest in the shells of these snails. You have some bees that are in the same family as the group I just showed you that collect little flower petals, and they line their nest cells with these flower petals and make this art, which is just beautiful. So not many bees do this, but it's a fun example. And then you have some bees not too far east of here that nest in sandstone. So they actually excavate in the sandstone and make their nests in these kind of sandstone walls. Just incredible how they do that. And their mandibles get all worn down, but this is how they've evolved to live. So I just wanted to give you a few examples just to underscore how diverse bees actually are, and give you just a couple little vignettes about some of the interesting things that they do. So I'm going to talk about bee conservation and some of the bees that are facing extinction. But I do want to make a special point that one of the bees I'm not going to be talking about tonight is this bee, the western honeybee, Apis mellifera. So this is a bee that's not wild in the United States because it's not native. It was brought here hundreds of years ago, primarily for use of the wax that it produces and the honey that it makes. Now we use them a lot for crop pollination. So honeybees are not wild, and so they're not targets of conservation here in the US. The wild bees are. So I wanted to make that point because I know a lot of people know about honeybees. And honeybees, as I said, are used intensively for crop pollination. You've probably seen these hive boxes on the sides of roads. They're trucked around. They're used for almond pollination, lots of other crops. So we move them around and we use them for their pollination services, but they also escape from these hives sometimes, and they establish themselves as feral populations. So I do a lot of hiking, and I can be out in the San Jacintos at 10,000 feet elevation, and I'll see honeybees. And they're definitely not coming from any managed hives because that's national forest. These are honeybees that have escaped at some point from these managed hives, and they've established themselves out in our natural areas. So not only are honeybees not a target of conservation here in the US because they're not wild, but they can actually harm wild bees. And they do this in a few different ways, but the photo I'm about to show you illustrates one of them pretty clearly. they're really good at taking food resources out of environments. So if you've heard of the dance language in honeybee, of the honeybee, it's the only symbolic language that's ever been discovered in any animal other than humans. The dance language that honeybees have is a thing that they can use to recruit their sisters to really good food resources. And so honeybees are incredible when they move into an area at taking a lot of the floral food resources out of those landscapes. And a lot of our wild native bees populations really depend on those flowering plants and the pollen and nectar that they provide. And so when the honeybees come in, they extract a lot of the food resources and don't leave much for the wild native bees. So I just wanted to make that point. And now I want to tell you, so that was a little bit of the trouble that wild bees are in, and now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the evidence. That many of those incredible bee species that I talked about and all that diversity, many of those species really need our help because they're facing an elevated risk of extinction. So I'm going to show you in the next few slides some of the evidence that we have for that. But I want to preface first by talking for a moment about the red list. Have y'all all heard of the IUCN red list? Okay, it's something that's been developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is an international body that assesses the status of species. And when I even think of the red list, I tend to think of things like the tiger and some of our other big charismatic species that have been assessed. So if you have heard of the red list, you've probably heard about it in association with rhinos and tigers and things like that that have been assessed. But there are some insect groups that have been assessed as well, including some bees. And I want to show you in the next slide sort of the categories that the red list places species into, because it's a little bit of context for the next slide. So when species get evaluated to be placed on this red list, basically a bunch of scientists get together and they look through all the evidence and data we have for a certain species, and they bin that species into one of these categories. And the categories can range anything from extinct all the way over to there's no concern, populations seem to be stable, good numbers, and then everything in between. And so species get placed in one of these categories. I'll just mention too, one of these categories is data deficient, which basically means we've assessed the species and we just don't have enough information to really evaluate it. So species get placed in one of these categories when they're evaluated for the red list. So I can tell you that not a few hundred bee species at present have been evaluated for this red list, but a recent study, it came out just this year, by Tara Cornelisi and colleagues that evaluated extinction risk in a bunch of different groups in North America, found that more than a third of bees, of the species that they assessed, are at an elevated risk of extinction. So just to show you this, they also took all the groups that they looked at and they ranked them. And so groups at the top, and you'll see bees are at the very top, have the highest proportion of species at an elevated risk of extinction. So this is some evidence based on the bees that have been evaluated that quite a few of our bee species are at risk of extinction, along with other groups, but bees, again, ranked highest here. Bumblebees are one group, and that's the bee group that I work on specifically, have been evaluated the most extensively of any bee group. And so bumblebees, more than a quarter of species in North America, are at an elevated risk of extinction. So all the categories here, all these slices of the pie, are at an elevated risk. And so bumblebees are also threatened. Some bumblebees are also threatened with extinction. You might have heard of this bumblebee, Bombus affinis. This is the first bumblebee to be added to our federal endangered species list. It was added in 2017. So this is a bee that's now receiving federal protection. And it's a bee that I've been starting to do some work on. So it was the first, but there is a queue of bumblebees that are being considered for listing as well, including this species, Bombus occidentalis. This is one of the species, if you heard about some of the legal things going on here in California about whether bees were fish or fish. I'm not sure if you heard about this. Okay, if you want to ask me a question about it after the talk, I can tell you more about that. It was a legal issue. This is one of 4 bees that may end up on our state endangered species list. So it's found here in California. You can still find it in a few places, but it's pretty rare, and it used to be really common. So it's probably going to get added to our endangered species list as well. So that's a bit of gloom and doom, and I do want to kind of recognize that, but it's good to get real about how bees are actually doing. But now I want to talk about some of the fun things that my lab group is doing to try to protect bees, because there are a lot of initiatives going on now at the national and international scale to try to protect all these wild bees, because a lot of people care about them and recognize that we need them for healthy ecosystems and because they deserve protection. So I'm going to talk about 4 things or 4 areas that I've been working on to try to promote bee conservation. The first one I'm going to talk about is really, a lot of problems are really people problems. And so we're at the heart of some of the issues going on. And I think that we're also can be the solution to trying to fix things. So I've been trying to organize bee researchers in the US to try to get us kind of on board and consolidated and working together on some issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're starting to coordinate at a scale here in the US that we haven't been before. I'm going to talk a little bit about new methods being developed, and the bit I told you about the red list and evaluating extinction risk is going to come up again because some of the methods we're working on have to do with that. I'm going to talk about a wild bee monitoring program that we're building, and I'll explain what I mean by that and how exciting that is. And then I'm going to talk about some new frameworks for bee conservation that I'm helping to develop. So on the first topic, this idea of coordinating and getting people to work together, for several years now, I've been leading what's called the National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network. It's a mouthful. It's a group now of more than 700 people across the US who are academics like myself, folks working at nonprofits in conservation, species and land managers working at the state and federal level, a lot of different people across the US. And we've been trying to figure out where is our common ground? What are some of the things that we all agree need to happen if we want to do a better job of protecting our bee conservation, or our bee populations? So I'm not going to read this entire list. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights for you. One thing that we realized, and y'all saw this in one of the previous slides, is that we need to collect more data in more places. We have some places where we've never even collected any bee data at all. They're probably entirely new species. Those species might need our help. We need to know where they are. So we need to do what's called an inventory, where we go out and we look for different species and we try to get a sense of where you find different bee species. To do that, we need to support bee taxonomy better. Taxonomy is the part of science that works to describe species and study their characteristics. And it's an area of science that's traditionally been underfunded and is definitely underfunded in bee world. And so we need more support for those folks. We need to be doing a better job with sharing our data and standardizing how we collect it and so on. And so this is something we all agree on, which is great to find some consensus. Another is that we need to coordinate more when we're doing these things. And so if we work together, if I say, okay, I'm in California, I can cover these areas. You're in Virginia, if you can cover those areas. If we get enough people in our network working together and telling each other where we're going and collecting and coordinate where we go, then we could cover the entire US and we can get a sense of where we find bees, what species we find across the US. So that's something we see as a high priority. Obviously, if you don't even know what species you have, you can't protect all of them, right? So we need to figure out that basic information. I'm going to talk more about a wild bee monitoring program in a few slides, so I'll skip over that for now. And then another area that we recognize is that conservation resources are limited. We can't save everything all the time, and we do recognize that. So we need some frameworks in place for how we direct our resources and attention. And so there are certain places in the US that are safe harbors for some of our bee populations. We need to find out where those places are and work harder to protect them. So we need to prioritize those places. There are also some species, I showed you that ranking of, for the red list, species that are critically vulnerable. They're on the brink of extinction. We need to be moving in and intervening to save those species. We should be trying to save and protect and promote everything. But, in a world with limited resources, we have to do a little bit of prioritization and systematically work to preserve these species. So we recognize that we need to do a little bit of work to understand what we need to prioritize for protection. All of these things are going to be submitted in an article to Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So you'll hopefully be able to read some of the consensus views of all of these scientists and conservationists soon. Another project I've been working on is the State of the Bees. Have y'all heard of the Xerces Society before? Okay, I'm seeing heads nodding, yes. It's a nonprofit here in the US that works to protect invertebrates, and so they do a lot of work to help save bees. They have projects like, for example, the California Bumblebee Atlas, which is a project that's collecting bumblebee data across the state that anyone can get involved in, and so I'm happy to tell you more about that. So this is a collaborative project between my lab group and the Xerces Society. It's led by Saf Killingsworth from Xerces and a researcher, Oscar Martinez Lopez, in my lab. And the goal of this project is to evaluate the extinction risk of all bees in the US. So there are more than 3,600 species, and I mentioned earlier, only a few hundred of them have actually been evaluated. So we want to try to get them all evaluated. This project is funded by a lot of different funders and supporters, and I just wanted to recognize them in this slide. So as I mentioned, we want to take every single bee species, gather the data, evaluate it, and put them into one of these categories so that we can know for every species here in the US which ones are of less concern because they're doing better, and which are the ones that are more on the brink of extinction. And that's going to help us direct some of our resources and attention. Another thing I've been working to help create is a US wild bee monitoring program. And I want to take a moment to talk about monitoring and what I mean by that. To monitor, one way of thinking about it is it's a way of paying attention to something. It's repeatedly collecting data to assess how something is doing. And so for a species, for example, that are on our federal endangered species list, every species that's placed on the list ideally has a recovery plan. It's a plan for how we're going to save that species from extinction. And part of the recovery plan that you need to implement is you need to know whether the species is recovering or not. So you have to collect data on it. So I've been working to build a program that in some ways has been in the making for a very long time. So what seemed like a very long time ago now, in 2014, in a different administration, there was a task force created that was based on protecting pollinators. And one of the things this task force said that we need to do here in the US is have a better mechanisms in place for assessing how our bees are doing. And so they're essentially saying we need something along the lines of a monitoring program. So I got really interested in that idea and trying to push that forward. In 2018, I led a meeting to bring scientists together to try to figure out how we do that. We published that work in a paper that came out in 2020. If you're interested, this is the information for how to access that article. So we've been working towards this for a very long time, and now we finally have lined up a set of partners to try to build this monitoring program that's against the U.S. Wild Bee Monitoring Program, or USB for short. So we're working, interestingly enough, with some bat biologists to build this program. So you may or may not be familiar with the North American Bat Monitoring Program. It's this incredible coordinated program that does, just like I said earlier, I wish we had for bees, people coordinate and communicate about where they're collecting data so that they can fill gaps and work together and collect data that are standardized so that people can analyze them together. So the bat folks have created this North American Bat Monitoring Program. It's incredible. It helps coordinate all across North America, works across different scales, meets the needs of private landowners, people working in federal and state government, and it's helping get people the information they need about how bats are doing so that we can direct our resources and attention to the certain bats that need us. We want to build something similar for bees. And so this is what we're doing. This is funded by the Fish and Wildlife Center for Pollinator Conservation and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And it's a program through the USGS, which is where the North American Bat Monitoring Program lives within the USGS. So this is something that we're actively building right now. So another thing that we're doing for bees that I'm particularly excited about is advancing something called the Lost Species Framework. So lost species are defined as species that haven't been seen in 10 years or more. And I like to use this analogy because I think it's important. So if you haven't seen, if I lose my car keys, I don't automatically assume they're gone forever. I assume they're probably somewhere around my house, and this happens quite often, so things get lost a lot sometimes. I assume they're somewhere, and I go around and I look for them, and I find them. So lost species, you can think of them that way. Maybe I have lost my keys forever, but they're probably in my house somewhere. I just need to go look for them. And so species that are lost, they haven't been seen in the wild in 10 or more years, but they very much may still be out there. We just need to look for them. This idea is illustrated in this figure, and I want to take a minute to break it down because it might make your head hurt a little bit, but I want to take a moment on it because it helps explain the idea. So species that are extinct, you can look for them as much as you want. You're not going to find them. They're extinct. But there can also be species that are stable, and if you just look for them, if you haven't looked for them at all, you're going to call them lost. But if you just start to look for them, you can find them. And so species that are lost, they might actually be extinct or imperiled, or we maybe just haven't looked for them well enough. So the ivory-billed woodpecker is one of the kind of quintessential examples of a lost species. It might truly be lost, but there are other lost species that are out there that we can rediscover. And so I've been thinking a lot about this project or this framework for bees because I recently did a study where we found that more than half of bees in the US are technically lost. We don't have records for them in the last 10 years, but I bet a bunch of them are out there. We just haven't looked. So does anyone know what these three species have in common? I would not have known the answer to this until I made this figure, so let me go ahead and tell you. These are all species that were lost, and then they were rediscovered after a pretty long time. I mean, this little mole, De Winton's golden mole, wasn't seen for 87 years, and then we rediscovered it. It's pretty incredible. This chameleon wasn't seen for more than 100 years, and then it was rediscovered in 2020. So we can find things. Many things are still out there. We just have to look for them. And so I like the lost species framework too because I think it's hopeful. You know, I always hope my keys are out there somewhere, and I usually do find them. So we've been doing some work to try to understand. I mentioned I did a study a few years ago where we found that half of bee species in the US are technically lost. We've been digging back through more data to try to work harder on those numbers and get a better sense of things and expand our search. So across all of North America, there are more than 5,600 species. And I'm showing you here the number that are lost and the percent of the total. So in Canada, there are 603 bee species. 202 of them, or a third, are lost. Again, they may still be out there. We just don't have data for them. Here in the US, we have, this number kind of changes depending on what data source you look at, more than 3,000 species. We've looked really hard now for these species, and now we've revised our estimate to about a third of species are lost in the US. So we have quite a few bee species that, again, most are hopefully probably out there, but we need to go look harder for them. Here in California specifically, we have a ton of species here in California. This follows that pattern I showed where we have a lot of diversity out west. We have nearly 1,600 species, but more than half of species in California are lost. We don't have records. So we have a special guest in our audience tonight who's been working on this. Crystal Hickman is a friend of mine there. She's a National Geographic photographer and has a new book out that I love called The ABCs of California's Native Bees. Crystal goes around to places all over California and spends a lot of time staring at the ground and things, looking for bees, and then she finds them. And we had this list of bees that are lost in California, and we showed it to Crystal, Oscar and I. Oscar's the researcher in my lab working on this project. We shared this list with Crystal, and there were quite a few of them. She said, oh, I just saw that bee. I have a photograph of it. So here's one of her photographs. This is a bee that is long lost from California. That's another little tag that means hasn't been seen here in the scientific record in more than 50 years. There are only 2 records ever collected of this bee, and Crystal found it and photographed it and took this beautiful picture. So this illustrates the point, again, that I think we can have a lot of hope for these lost species. I think they're just out there. We haven't looked really carefully. We're not paying attention. And once we find something, if it is endangered and we get the evidence for that, then we can start to take steps to try to protect these things. So rediscovery is kind of the foundational step to protecting some of these bee species. So this is something I'm really excited about expanding as a scientific framework and applying it to bees. The last project I want to close with, so I already told you I'm working with folks that work on bats. Well, now I'm starting to work with herpetologists as well, which I didn't anticipate doing, but it turns out that there's a lot of exciting vertebrate conservation efforts that are going on, and I want to learn what those projects are, and then I want to try to apply something similar to bees. So this is a project that is called the PARCA project, the Priority Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Areas. This is a huge project that's been going on for more than 10 years that's working to identify areas of the U.S. that are particularly important for protecting amphibian and reptile populations. So scientists and land and species managers work together to identify where these areas are. These are places that, for example, they might harbor and be safe havens for a threatened species or multiple threatened species. So it's a project to map out where these places are that we need to prioritize for protection. So this is a project that's been going on for quite a while. There's some states that are in progress. Many have been covered, and they've mapped out these areas. And I want to do something similar for bees. I want to find the places across the U.S. that are really important for bee populations. And I can tell you that California is going to have a lot of these places. We have a lot of pockets of land that's still undeveloped, still protected, and really important areas to kind of rally around to protect for our bee populations. So I'm excited to see how things play out here in California. So for this project, we're working with JJ Apodaca, who helped create this framework and implement it and he's a herpetologist, as you can see from him holding these turtles. So we're working with him to do a similar thing for bees and find these areas. And this is something else I'm really excited about because, again, it's this idea that we do have to make some choices and prioritize where we're going to direct things. And so this is another framework for trying to figure out how to do that. If it were up to me, I would plant wildflowers everywhere and protect everywhere for bees. But I realize that we have a lot of different interests and things that we need to that we value here in the U.S. And so maybe we can't make the entire U.S. bee-friendly habitat, but we can certainly find those places where it's particularly important and direct our efforts there. So this is something that we're going to be working on in the coming years. So stay tuned for which places in California get picked as safe harbors for bee populations. So I told you a little bit about bees, and then I gave you a little bit of bad news that the evidence that we have, it does suggest that many of our bees are facing an elevated risk of extinction. And so there is some bad news there, but there is a lot of hope too. There are a lot of big projects going on. Insects for a long time have not been really included in conservation efforts at the same scale as large vertebrates. We tend to focus on the things that are really large and charismatic and that we can see really easily. And I understand why we do that or why we have done that, but people are starting to really focus on the little things more now and appreciate them. And some of these frameworks that have been developed, the IUCN Red List was originally developed for big vertebrates. The criteria, they're really developed to try to understand the status of vertebrate populations. So we've had to do some special work to even figure out how to apply them to bees. So a lot of these frameworks, this monitoring program for bats, the PARCA project for amphibians and reptiles, I think these things can be modified and adapted for bees too, to try to protect them. And these frameworks and programs have been really successful. So I'm working with the people that built these successful programs for vertebrates to try to figure out how to build smart programs for bees too. And my hope is that we can ultimately protect all of our bee species here in the U.S., understand what they are, find the lost ones, help protect their populations, help protect their habitats. So with that, I want to say a special thank you. I work with a lot of people, especially for the project on coordinating bee research across the US. So all these people and more to thank. If you'd like to learn more about the bee monitoring coordination network that I mentioned, you can use this QR code. If you want to learn more about some of the other work that we do, including the research in Alaska and things with queen bumblebees and other work, you can go to the QR code on the right, which goes to my lab's website. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.